The story begins with a group of investigative journalists who decided to write a collection of real horror stories collected from around the world. Inspired by myths, survivor stories, and archival records, they set out on journeys through forgotten villages, dark forests, and abandoned houses to collect authentic stories about what scares people really. Their goal was to find out what kind of stories are considered the most creepy in different parts of the world and how these stories differ. The lead author of the project was a reporter named Kevin, a fearless and skeptical professional. He is one of those who is used to checking facts and does not believe in all sorts of tall tales. Kevin gathered a small but experienced team, which included Laura, a psychology specialist with a special interest in fears and their impact on consciousness. Mike, a photographer famous for unique shots capturing empty, abandoned places. And Jason, a producer who is able to organize any event and fearlessly enter even the most creepy rooms. Together, they had already dealt with strange, disturbing stories more than once, but the new task was different. This time, they had to not just collect material, but personally experience the stories in order to understand their essence and make a real collection of truth from them. For their first research, they chose a remote, mysterious forest village that few people knew about. There were rumors in the surrounding areas that people had been living there for decades, almost cut off from civilization, not accepting outsiders, and the place was surrounded by tragic stories about missing people. In the city archives, Laura found an old newspaper that talked about a group of tourists who disappeared there about 20 years ago. The record said that neither their bodies nor traces could be found. And according to one version, the villagers could have been involved in these disappearances. As soon as they arrived at the place, it became clear that the legends about the village were far from just empty words. The road leading to it was a narrow, winding path on which only small cars could pass, and as they moved deeper into the forest, the air became heavier and they were surrounded only by wild trees, on which the wind strangely arranged branches, as if the forest itself was trying to scare them away. They traveled to the village almost all day, and upon arrival they were met by a local resident, a laconic old man with a weathered face, whom everyone called Ray. He has lived in this village all his life and for a small fee agreed to take journalists around the neighborhood. The old man warned them that they should not spend the night here, especially for strangers, but his urgency only fueled the interest of the whole group. The first thing they did was go to the place where the last group of missing tourists had once been spotted. It was a dense patch of forest with several ancient buildings whose roofs had half caved in from time and winds. The landscape around looked ominous, but not so frightening that the professional team wanted to abandon the goal. According to legend, in one of these houses there should have been a diary of one of the missing, left under mysterious circumstances. Ray said that the locals do not go there, considering the house cursed and as if belonging to past times that it is better not to wake up. The weather began to deteriorate, and as dusk turned into a dark night, the house became more and more menacing. Kevin insisted that they have time to inspect it before it gets completely dark, as the next day was planned for interviews with local residents. Their group entered the house, finding that the room had long been abandoned, with dilapidated furniture and cracked wallpaper. In one of the rooms, Mike noticed a battered, dusty notebook lying on the floor next to some kind of iron object, half embedded in the ground. Kevin opened it, carefully flipping through the yellowed pages, written in a sloppy handwriting that made some words difficult to make out. The first entries were quite ordinary. Tourists described their first days in the village, talked about its inhabitants and the strangeness of their behavior. But the further the narrative went, the more strange the recordings became. On the 5th page of the diary, Kevin stopped, frowning. It read, "They never leave the forest, and whoever stays here at night becomes a part of it forever." He had barely finished reading the sentence when he heard a soft, barely audible whisper behind him. The others also started, looking around for the source of the sound. The house remained empty, except for them and Ray. But the strange feeling of being watched grew stronger. Jason laughed, trying to calm the others down, But Kevin just shook his head, continuing to read the diary. The next entry looked particularly gloomy. At first they just watch, but when night falls, you stop understanding where your thoughts are and where theirs are. This line sounded almost like a warning, but the journalists wrote it off as the usual travel fears and overexertion. When they left the house, Ray noticed that it was already quite dark and suggested that they return to their camp. However, Kevin insisted on continuing the research. There were several more abandoned places waiting for them, which, in his opinion, could contain even more clues to the story, but Laura began to get nervous. She asked if they should continue with such a risk, but Kevin brushed off her concerns. Plunging back into the forest, they found themselves in a small camp where they expected to spend the night. Having pitched tents and built a fire, they decided to discuss the notes they had read. Mike joked that the night watchmen from the diary are just fiction, and they only scare themselves. Nevertheless, Laura, always sensitive to the mood, looked gloomy and listened attentively to the forest around, listening to every rustle. Their conversations began to fade as the night deepened. Gradually, even Kevin began to feel a little uneasy, as if they were surrounded by invisible eyes watching every move. When the fire was almost out, each of them peered into the darkness, clutching flashlights and trying not to succumb to the growing sense of danger. The night was dark, impenetrable, and it seemed that every tree was hiding in the semi-darkness, hiding something more than just shadows. Laura, who decided to distract herself a little, took the diary and went deep into reading. Her face changed, reflecting more and more anxiety as she read the next entry. "They won't let you leave. We have to stay. I hear them whispering every night." Laura wrote, muttering the last line out loud. She tried to laugh, but it was a nervous, strained laugh. Mike just shrugged in response, apparently feeling the tension himself. At some point, the forest began to fill with strange sounds. It wasn't just the sound of the wind or the rustle of leaves. Something was making a shrill grunt, as if thin branches were breaking under some unnatural pressure. The branches swayed, creating the illusion of footsteps, and although they tried to convince themselves that it was all just a figment of their imagination, the feeling of watching became unbearable. Jason, always rational and balanced, suddenly stood up and began to look around the neighborhood. His gaze was wary, as if he was picking up on something that the others hadn't noticed. Kevin, sensing that the tension within the group was growing, suggested that everyone calm down and return to the tents, but then suddenly there was a sharp crack from somewhere deep in the forest. The noise was so loud that for a moment everyone froze. "What was that?" Laura asked in a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. In response, silence. No one knew where the sound came from. It was too loud for the usual falling of a branch, and too sharp to be just the noise of the forest. Looking in the direction of the noise, they felt the hairs on the back of their necks begin to stand on end. Everything that was happening felt wrong, unnatural. "We have to get out of here," Laura finally muttered, fear slipping into her voice, which she usually knew how to hide. But Kevin, despite the growing tension, insisted on his own. "We are already here. If we leave, it's all in vain. Let's stay a little longer and try to understand what it is." Everyone was against it, but looking at Kevin, they restrained themselves. Mike even tried to turn the camera back on, but to his surprise, it suddenly refused to work. The night sounds continued to grow louder. A few minutes later, there was another crack, but this time closer and much stronger than the first one. Everyone looked at each other without saying a word, and everyone felt the horror begin to seep into their thoughts. Were those diary entries true? Are they becoming part of the story they were trying to capture? Suddenly, Jason stood up and announced that he was leaving. He decided to check if they had left something important at the place of the previous stop where they found the diary. Laura tried to stop him, but he was determined. "I'll be back soon. Just stay in the camp and everything will be fine," he said, walking confidently into the darkness. Those who remained in the camp watched as his flashlight slowly disappeared into the inky darkness of the forest. Time passed, but he never returned. After a few minutes, Laura noticed that her flashlight was blinking strangely, and when she turned it on again, the battery was almost empty, although it had been fully charged before. The same thing happened with the rest of the lanterns. One by one, they started to flicker and then completely turned off. Maybe these batteries are just old? Mike asked uncertainly, although he knew it was unlikely. Ahead in the darkness, a faint flicker suddenly appeared. The only source of light. They noticed that a light flicker appeared for a moment in the depths of the forest, after which it slowly began to approach. "Hey, Jason, is that you?" Kevin shouted, but there was no response. The light was getting closer, but it was hard to make out what exactly was creating this flicker. They didn't see anything like a lantern or other equipment, just a light spot that seemed to be floating in the air. When at last the light began to break through the foliage, dispelling the darkness of the night, Kevin realized that the whole night had passed. The forest seemed to come to life, and the sounds of the night gave way to the familiar noise of the awakening forest. However, neither Jason nor Ray returned, which filled the remaining ones with real horror. Laura, who had not closed her eyes all night, whispered, "We have to leave." Her voice was muffled, hoarse with fear. Kevin agreed, and along with Mike and Laura, they hurried out of the place, leaving behind all the tents and equipment that could delay them. They had to move fast, but with each step it became clearer they were lost. No matter how much they walked, the trees did not thin out, and the road only led them deeper into the thicket. After several hours of wandering, exhausted, they finally stumbled upon a familiar path, the same one they had come to the village by. Staggering with fatigue, they reached the car, where they found, to their shock and horror, torn tracks on the ground, as if someone had severely damaged both the wheels and the doors, which were now covered with scratches. Soon, making their way along a narrow path, they managed to find another way to the nearest town, where they immediately contacted the police, telling them about Jason and Ray, who remained in the camp. Their story was almost unheard. The locals were used to stories of disappearances in this forest and explained almost with irritation that there were many such stories, but even the police squad did not dare to look for anyone here. A few weeks after returning to the city, the police reported that no traces of Jason and Ray had been found, only abandoned equipment at their last stop. Kevin and the others tried to comprehend what had happened, but none of them could forget the strange, haunting silence that surrounded them in the last hours at the camp. Laura tried to get back to normal, but the nightmares continued to torment her. Mike sold his camera and no longer took up photography, and Kevin, who assembled the entire group, retired from journalism without finishing the project they were working on. They never managed to figure out what happened that night in the forest, but each of them was forever associated with the horror they experienced. Years later, Laura accidentally came across an article about disappearances in the same village. There were new tourists mentioned who also had a setback in the forest. There was only one small fragment in this article that struck her. A local resident named Ray last saw them when they went into the woods and has also been missing since then.